See. Hey y'all, I'm Arwen, the professional joy seeker. I'm also a professional tarot reader, and as you know, a bit of a deck collector. We're going to talk today about a deck that's not available. But wait, you can get it tomorrow. So I want to get y'all excited about it. It's a collaborative effort. Several people I know are members of this collaborative group. One is Joanna Powell, who y'all know I talk about Joanna all the time. She's the guy in tarot, and I go on her retreats. But also the mastermind, the evil mastermind behind this, Kyle McGregor, and he runs a shop in Canada. And I'm not going to say the town because I just realized I didn't know if I just lost whether it was the T town or the O town, so I'll let them tell you. But please welcome Andrew McGregor. Andrew, say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody. It's the Toronto town. Yeah, I run a store up here in Toronto called the Hermit's Lamp. And I've been, professional reader for a long time. And I run a regular podcast by the same name as the store, the Hermit's Lamp. And so, and I've been working on this collaborative tarot deck with 72 artists for, a number of years now. Because, having that many people be involved in a project and having kids and having a business, it's hard to make time for things. But, this project has been important to me. So I've been, every time I can get back to it, I've been getting back to it. And as Arwen said, tomorrow's the big day. It's finally done and launching. So I'm very excited.
And it's interesting that you're launching a project called Triumph of Life on what many of us know as Day of the Dead. Can you talk a little bit about what the Triumph of Life is and where the whole idea came from?
So a number of years ago, my godmother passed away, my religious godmother, and she passed away on my birthday. And, as you imagine, that was kind of emotionally difficult. And then later that week, there was a mass shooting in the States. And then later that week, in the next few weeks, other sort of more public figures who were important to me in one way or another also died from cancer. And I just sort of was sitting there feeling despair and feeling this sort of, what on earth are we going to do? Is this world just like beyond helping? Like what on earth, right? And I was sort of sitting with my cards and sort of trying to find my way back to a sense of how I move forward from this situation. And it finally came to me. I was like, you know what? Life needs us to help it. That's what needs to happen here. We need to actually fight for life and help life and work on the side of life to work against death and, violence and cancer and all of these things. And so I decided that what I wanted to do, because my godmother had died from cancer, was to make a project where we could make something beautiful that could help people and that would in turn also generate money for cancer research. And so I started this tarot deck with the idea that every artist who made a card would ask themselves this question: what is it in this card that takes us from a place of loss and suffering to a place of joy and remembering? And so every artist worked to sort of find that turning point, that sort of, space where things shift back towards life's going to continue. I will remember these people. I will help carry this forward. Or for people who are going through those struggles themselves, how do they look forward? How do they think about what's going to come for them? And how do they think about having a future? So, yeah, so that's the story.
It's a beautiful, beautiful idea. Yeah, I love it. My mom passed away from cancer. So it's difficult time. I mean, she knew what was coming. We knew what was coming. It was inoperable, blah, 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 tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Her process with it really helped me on a personal level. So I don't even want to say brave or courageous. She was just strong. So she had her moments where, nobody really chooses to want
Hmm.
to pass away, I think. Um, but I really love the idea of having a card grief and try to give it a point to translate to something else, because you have to move away from the grief. You've got to move through it on some level, or you've given your life away because
Yeah,
somebody else is
exactly.
gone. And it's a big sacrifice. So can you show us some of these cards and maybe talk a little bit about them?
Yeah. So the thing that I wanted to do when I put out that I was looking for artists is I wanted to make this a community project, I mean, I know lots of professional tarot deck creators and so on. I mean, I know lots of tremendous artists, and I didn't want to not include those people, but I also wanted this to really be a community driven project. And so when I started making the deck, I invited anybody to make a card. And I had some people come forward and say, I'm not an artist. I've never made anything like this, but like I went through this thing with this relative and I want to make a card in honor of them. And I was like, okay, let's do it, you know? And so, the deck is quite varied. Here's this Knight of Cups.
I like that. I love the bear with the heart.
Yeah, definitely. Um, the Eight of Cups,
Oh,
and
that's
there's a really
gorgeous.
nice.
Who should? Because if
There's
they said they weren't an artist, they're crazy. That's beautiful.
Well, exactly right. Everybody who puts something in, it's beautiful, right? There's no card in the deck where I feel like, oh, I wish this wasn't included. There's no deck that's sorry. There's no card that stands out where anybody has been, saying to me, oh, this doesn't look like it belongs. I've had the chance to sit down with a bunch of uh, different readers because I've had a sample deck for a few months now, and at events that I've been
That
at.
artist. That's Roxy.
Yeah, exactly. Some of them are quite distinctive, right? Like you're going to look at them and be like, "Oh, I know exactly who that is," right? Um, there's a wonderful thing that happens where if you look at like two cards side by side, you might think, "Oh, wow, those are so radically different." Like the style between these two cards. But when you're working with the whole deck, there's a cohesion that starts to emerge that really brings a lot forward and makes it, quite amazing.
Oh, that's lovely. Now that looks like um Richard. I can't think of his last name. Has a similarity to one of the decks I have.
Hmm.
Was that?
I don't necessarily remember exactly who did every card. 72 correspondences is a lot to hold in my sleep-addled dad brain, but yeah. And some of them, like this one, this is a stained glass. So some people took some
Oh,
quite different takes on the approach, and they sort of worked in mediums that you wouldn't usually think of including in a
now
deck.
was that the two of discs on that one, or was that the? I don't think it was a tower. It looked more like a two of discs to me.
So it's the Four of Wands. Actually, you can see the wands coming up the sides.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. I wasn't keying in on those, so yeah.
Hmm.
It's a beautiful card, though. Wow, stained glass. I'm impressed.
And it's one of those things that's really interesting um, because some of the cards are not what people would necessarily expect. If you're a Rider Waite person and that's your background, and you look at them, you'll be like, oh, I'm not quite sure how this fits. But when you sit and look at them a little bit longer, the imagery emerges and the connections start to be there. There's no card here that is to me that sort of falls outside of those things. So And this is
Yeah.
the
In the coming Cartomancer, we have a an article on uh, how to learn a new deck. If you've got a deck that you work with a lot and you get a new deck, how do you work with that? Somebody asked me that on one of my YouTube shows. And so instead of answering it, I threw it out to a whole bunch of people and got answers back from like Paul Nagy, Barbara Moore, Teresa Reed, Mary Kay Green. I can't remember who Benabel. Benabel was the other person. And they all brought I'm calling it the experts roundtable. And I'm going to do this each time. So don't be surprised if you get an email, because I'm just randomly picking different people when I get a question like that to throw out and then put it in the Cartomancer, so we get kind of a melange maybe of answers. And one of the things everybody said was, don't your memorized meanings on a new deck, kind of let it speak to you. Learn what the artist, or artists in this case, want. Some more images, and maybe talk to us about some of the, what was like a difficult card, or I know you did some of the cards, right? Because you're an artist yourself.
Yeah, I'll find some of my cards as we go through. So here's one that that was I think really important. This is the Knight of Wands, and this caused a division, and some people left the project. All right, you know, you can see here you've got an activist riding on a vehicle here, and it says Black Lives Matters on it, and in the background you've got this image of a cell from Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks was this person who, their story is really worth looking up, you know. They're a person of color whose cells were taken without consent and replicated endlessly for cancer research, right? And recently, I think it was last year, their family, their descendants finally owned the rights, got the rights back to this material that came from the body of this woman, right? So it really ties into the history of cancer research, as well as the history of oppression and problematic scientific methods, and you know, all of these kinds of things, right? And so when the artist who did this card sent it in, I thought it was utterly genius. And then, you know, a variety of people made the choice that they felt that politics didn't belong in this kind of process, which is their choice to make, and left the project, you know. And but to me, I think that if we're going to talk about cancer, and we're going to talk about, you know, the history or the life of it, right, we need to confront these things that come through from science that are problematic, that are a history of racism and classism and colonialism and all of these problems, right? And I think so when I saw this deck, I thought it was genius, and that it was really important that it be there, you know? So.
And we need more diversity in decks anyway, just flat out, period. We need more diversity. Even decks that I've worked on, I mean, the Fairy Tale Lenormand, Lisa Hunt and I were very focused on getting a broad range of cultural fairy tales. And so some of that did translate into the imagery. And but there's still room. I mean, we have decks coming out like Courtney Alexander's Dust to Onyx, which is really I can't wait to get my hands on this deck because of the whole message behind it. But how do you feel like your deck addresses diversity? I mean, we've got that wonderful, and I'm a fan of that Knight of Wands. I think it's a fabulous message, and I didn't know about that, right? And I consider myself fairly well informed. I'm informed on areas that we can consider. That's where, you know, people, when I talk about white privilege, that's what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
My white privilege kind of blinds me to some of this information because the people in charge don't put it out.
Yeah, I mean,
so
when I started this project 5 years ago, and this is a kind of an interesting thing, I guess. I haven't really thought about it in this way, but when I started this project almost 5 years ago, I did not start it with the intention of pursuing diversity as a through line of the deck, right? I mean, it wasn't part of my agenda. It wasn't even really probably on my awareness enough at that time to be a through line of it, right? And so my focus was really on connecting with artists and getting artists who wanted to be involved to make the art that they wanted to make. And so in terms of diversity, I think that it certainly could be more diverse. There are a number of artists of color involved, and so on. So there is some elements of that, but it's not, it was never really a focus in the creation process. And, part of that came from a lack of consciousness at that time. I think that were I to start now, I would try and pay more attention to that. And partly finding enough artists who can actually show up and follow through and make stuff and get it in was such a challenge for me that completing the deck was really the thing that that took a great focus from me. I kept being like, I've got this many cards left. Who wants to do a card? It's this project sort of preceded but coincided with another deck with a similar focus. And so then people were kind of in on one project and didn't want to be in on both. And, it's just one of those things where it was difficult to sort of make enough connections for it. But yeah.
And, when you think about it, it's a lot of cards. And people, this is why, even when it's, one artist and one writer, and people are like, you announced the deck in 2012, and now you tell me I'm not going to get it till 2019. Why are you so slow? It's a creative process.
Yeah.
To do what you can when you can, but you cannot, you can't go outside with a stick and whap passerbys and say, you're going to do a card for me, get in the shop.
I wish so, right? Yeah, exactly, right? And, I just finished in September, I finished a deck that I made for Llewellyn. So I finished the deck and the book. And, it'll be out fall next year. And that took me 18 months. Probably I could have done it sooner because it did a lot in the last stretch, as is also the case. But, the thing is, too, what people don't understand is when you're getting into a project like making a tarot deck, whether you're doing all the work or working with other people, most of the time, or at least, my experience, life rolls along beside it, right? And so, during the creation of this deck, my partners had 2 surgeries. My father-in-law passed away, from cancer also. Like there are so many things that come up, and each of those things seems like it should be a discrete period in time. But it takes a long time to find the inspiration and the energy to kind of get back to stuff after something difficult happens, And like for me, I often think these days where if something big is going to happen, if there's some planned thing, or like after my father-in-law passed away, I'm like, our life is just going to be kind of the shadow of this probably for at least 6 months on a regular basis, right? And it's just there, and it's important to acknowledge and honor that and be like, all right, this sucks. It's going to take time. It's going to take it's not that it necessarily interferes with the ability to show up during that time, but it sort of interferes with resilience, right? At least that's sort of my experience of it. And so what happens is you're going along, you're like living day to day, you're getting your groceries and taking the kids to school and stuff. And then you bump into something and you're like, I have no slack left at all for anything. And now I'm stuck, right? And whether that's with the project or whether that's something else unrelated, that's what makes these sort of longer term projects very difficult. And I think that that's a part of the grief and loss process that people don't really understand or accept clearly. And, it's important, it's really important to recognize that stuff takes a long time to shake out. So
It does. And it's odd where it will pop up. My mom's been dead. My niece is 16. So my mom's been dead 15 and a half years. And I was just going through a box of something and pulled out a bunch of papers and I'm shuffling through them, and there is a letter from my mother to me. To stop and go, and deal with that. I also have found that when I'm working on something and something unexpected happens, something bad happens, I attach that shock and upset and grief to whatever I was working on. So it's like I'm a little mollusk. And when I come back to that thing that I need to do, first I have to scrape off all of my attachment to that grief or shock thing that happened. And it's I think that we talk about being awoke, awakened, and being woke and being aware. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's harder to be awake and aware. Work. It would be much easier to be kind of, oh yeah, that's I'm just going to work on this and not think about that. But some of the best art in the world has come from that well of grief, that well of loneliness. Sorry, had to say it. But lesbian coming out. So how do you think, and cancer, I was going to say cancer doesn't respect diversity either. So sure. I would, cancer doesn't really say, well, because you are, a child, I'm going to leave you alone. They don't. It doesn't. Segue. Coming back to the idea of grief and art. How do you personally, if it's not too personal, process grief when you're doing art? Is art a release for you, or is it something you can only do when you're in a channel of joy, I guess?
So it depends on the answer. Like many things, is it kind of depends, right? For me, the biggest thing that I do these days is when I notice that anything is sort of off in my feelings, or like I'm like, I don't feel clear. I feel like I'm struggling more with things that my judgment says ought to be more straightforward, whatever it is, right? Or where I'm just having feelings that I'm like, this doesn't really seem like me. Like I don't usually get upset about these kinds of things. I go back to my cards, right? And I ask myself, what's actually going on here, right? And then, I think, I go back to this quote from Aleister Crowley about the sword as a magical instrument, right? He talks about this in his book, Magic in Theory and Practice. And, he basically says of the sword that its job is to break down the demons of complexity into the simplicity of truth. Because if it's not simple, it's not true. And while I don't think that that's necessarily entirely universal, I certainly think in the way that I apply it, it is for me. And so I'm like, where there's a lot of feelings, I'm like, there's more than one thing going on. What is it? What are the pieces? What, as you say, is maybe mollusked on from somewhere else, right? What is some legacy of a thought or a belief that no longer applies to me? That hangs in there. What is some external judgment or criticism? What is something I've been ignoring and therefore it's kind of festering, right? And so, for me, I try and regularly, and by regularly I mean like 3 or 4 times a week, especially if I'm going through hard times, retune myself back towards what I would call sort of the wholeness of myself, and really kind of figure out what it is that needs attention. What is it that I need to make myself be able to show up? And then when I'm working on a project, like when I was finishing my tarot deck in the end of summer and beginning of fall, my mantra is shut up and be a professional and just make the stuff. And I just literally go back and be like, be a pro, be a pro. This is time to be a pro. Show up and do it. If you were making car parts, you would show up and make car parts, show up and make stuff. And then if I need to remake it or I need to whatever, I will. But if I show up and, put my stylus on my iPad or paint on paper or whatever I'm doing, most of the time it works out well. And it really, I think that there's this, I think it's a lie that we as artists tell ourselves sometimes, that, you know, we have to wait for the inspiration, we have to wait for whatever. I used to think that that was really, really true, you know, and I mean, I went to art school. I did 4 years of studying and making sculpture, and, you know, I've made lots of art along the way. And I now think that I'm really of the opinion that it's a discipline like anything else. I show up, I make the time, I make the stuff happen. Even if it's not all usable, it moves a project forward, and then it gets there, you know?
When I first began as a fiction writer, and I'm a member of Romance Writers of America. And when I went to an RWA conference, there was a shirt that said, "Bitch, okay." And it's a lot in writing, and it means butt in the chair, board.
Uh-huh.
You know, you don't have, if you're a professional, and you'll hear this a lot in the writer's world, writer's block, it's an excuse. And, you know, we joke about the fact that, oh, I have to write today. I'll do that right after I clean the toilets, get the cat boxes, and vacuum under the couch.
Yeah.
You know, you always find something else to do.
Sure.
For me, I don't want to write. I sit down and start writing. And then when I have to stop, I don't want to stop. Do you find that?
Yep. Yeah, there's this like productivity guy named Merlin Mann, and he said in something I was listening to that if you're a writer, your job is to spend as much time as often as you can making the clackety sound on the keyboard. That's the work. If you do that, everything else will sort out. And I think it's true. You know, I mean, we think that we ought to make something good, or it better be right, or, you know, whatever. It's like, we can't guarantee that. We can never guarantee that, even if we're feeling fresh and inspired. I've been inspired and looked at stuff and been like, what a bogus pile of crap. Like, you know? So.
Yeah. Oh, and I apologize, y'all. Bentley decided it was mama time.
Yeah.
So, let's not show that part be. But I really like the idea of also in writing, and I don't know about in art, because I'm not, I'm a word artist. I'm not a paint or I don't know what the correct term would be. I was going to say material artist, but that doesn't work.
Yeah,
but
visual.
In writing, visual, thank you. I give myself permission to write crap. The first draft is called a rough draft for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's not called the going to turn it into my editor and get accepted.
Nope.
Draft. When you're painting, when you're doing, I know I would assume on a tablet you have more freedom, but if you're putting paint on paper, do you have the luxury of a draft?
I used to. So my art has gone this sort of long arc towards what it is now. When I was in art school, everything was very postmodern theory driven. And so everything needed to be, in order to be accepted, really conceptual. You know, I used to joke, if you couldn't write a 50-page essay about why you did what you did, you wouldn't get a good mark, right? And it kind of, I really value that part of my education and that ability to deconstruct and think in those really sort of analytical ways. But I didn't really like that as an approach to making art. And when I left art school, I was really only interested in religious art and aesthetic art afterwards. And there really wasn't a lot of space for that in the program that I was in. And I also realized that I wasn't really interested in the art world as such. So I just stopped, you know, and I went into design and worked in design and advertising for a while. And then like maybe 10, 12 years after I graduated, a friend of mine put on a show where, sorry, while I was doing advertising, I discovered Adobe Illustrator and the capacity to make things mathematically perfect, which I really, really loved, right? And I really enjoy that kind of logo design, super crisp aesthetic, and I pursued it a lot. So then, fast forward a number of years, and a friend of mine decided to do a show that was all pictures of the Virgin Mary. And for whatever reason, I was like, yeah, I think I want to paint a Virgin Mary. And so I broke out my paints, which I hadn't touched in forever. I talked to my friend and got in the show, and I did my first painting. And I started painting again with gouache, which is a kind of opaque watercolor that lots
Okay.
of designers use, because you can make it kind of mathematically perfect if you're good at it. And then I went on this sort of arc of how small a brush can I get? How many hairs can I get? How many little lines can I make to make it exact, right? And I felt like I was going to end up becoming one of those people who does paintings on grains of rice just because it's, technically interesting. And so then I stopped and went in a different direction, and I started trying to do more gestural stuff and creative stuff, that was sort of very not abstract, but very like allowing for error to be inspiration, and not to have a pre-drawn out mathematical plan, to like not worry that like, oh look, the anatomy's a little off. It's like, what's the feel? Does it feel right? And
Yeah.
and that led me to create this. Both of my decks. I did a Tarot de Marseille style deck called Tarot Waiting to Happen, which is just black and white illustrated line work, of what happens just before the scene that we're used to seeing, and how does that inform what we understand about it. And so like the hangman in that card, for example, is a piece of chocolate cake sitting on the ground with a little booby trap rope around it, with some leaves hiding it. So, it's that temptation towards something.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So that was my first project. And then I did a deck, which I called the 90 question deck, which is questions with artwork. And it's a lot of very sort of exploratory kind of stuff. Like for making that, I would just sit down. Sometimes I would sit down with a question and be like, oh, I need to make something to go with it. Sometimes I would just sit down and be like, this texture looks interesting on this brush. I'm going to play with this. And then that would lead to something. And then now, most of the time, for when I was making the deck that I just made, I would sit down and the backgrounds, the deck that I made is it's a exploration of where traditional Orisha practice, which is my personal practice, intersects with card meanings. And so it's sort of this exploration of the stories and ideas from the one side and the meanings from the tarot side. And a lot of the backgrounds of those cards are sort of inspired by African fabric sort of styles, and then which are then layered with sort of symbolic meanings, and then there's figures in the foreground. So often I would start with this sort of very graphic but very exploratory background, and then I would start to layer stuff on top. So it's not so much in that case that I would sort of, there were quite a number that I did just throw away, but often it would be like, I would do something, I'd be like, yeah, that line is wonderful. Okay, now I need to work with that line. And then I would sort of design and build off of those elements, but not in a really preconceived notion of what that design would look like. I'd be like, well, I want to tell this story, and this story has a river in it, and it has this character, and it has these other elements. And so I would like design a background first most of the time, and then I would start integrating the elements and the other pieces into it, kind of thing.
So you're a writer. I mean, that's what I do as a writer. I see, ow, sorry, try to detach the cat. I see a headline and I don't read the story. I just come up with what it's about. I see a person on the street and they have to be a character for me, or something that just It sparked my imagination, I guess is the best way to say it. But
Hmm.
what you just described is a lot like my writing process. So
Hmm.
that was really interesting to hear. Why don't you go there? We'll see how long that lasts. Um, so your process, and I've talked to several artists because of this channel. I've had a lot of luck in getting some great people like you and others here to chat with me about process. What was it like dealing with other artists who I'm sure did not have your process? I mean, were there moments of joy, of wow, I could use that
Hmm.
for
For
you?
making this deck? Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that one of the things that was very interesting was I had no clear expectation of. So I'm just flipping through to see. I had no clear expectations of what people were going to come back with, right? Like I literally said to people, try and answer the question. What is it in this card that takes us from loss and suffering to remembrance and joy? Keep that question in your mind, and then make some art, and that's it. That was all I really did. And so when stuff started coming back, um, I was just inspired by it, and I was really very open to it. And some people tried to or wanted maybe a bit more dialogue with me around it. They were like, I'm not really a tarot person, but I'm an artist and I want to make sure that it's right. Or I'm a tarot person, but I'm not so much of an artist, or those kinds of things. And I didn't really have a lot of dialogue with those people. I really tried to go back to, it's going to be awesome. You've got this. Do a thing, and then show me. And then if we need to talk about it, we can. But I think it'll be good. And there are only one or two cards where the technical execution required something from me afterwards. Like there was
Mhm.
one that was collaged, and it was some of the collage had that moire pattern that like printing uses. And then when that was photographed, it didn't quite. So I had to kind of go in and do a little stuff to maybe pull a few of those pieces um, into a more cohesive, uh, reproducible kind of way. But for the most part, everything that came in was great. And there were a couple of things, because when I started this project, my initial thought was, because when I started this project, Kickstarter was just starting, right?
Oh,
5 years ago. It was a relatively new thing. And I was like, it's great. We're going to Kickstarter it. We're going to print, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 decks, and we're going to sell them, right? And then people started getting sick of Kickstarter, right? I watched Kickstarters fail to get funded. Um, and so with this project, quite a ways into it, well after most people had finished their artwork, I switched the idea that we were going to use print on demand, and we're using Game Crafter as our printers, um, because I didn't want to get stuck trying to raise thousands of dollars where that money
yeah.
doesn't go to charity, right? And that's the problem with printing a deck. You can raise, 8 or 10 grand that you need to do a good print job, and you still haven't donated any money anywhere, right? So as we went through this process, I realized that if we did print on demand, starting tomorrow, November 1st, when the deck launches, um, approximately $12 from every single deck from sale one go to charity. Like that's it. It's done, right?
That's
Like,
awesome.
so it's immediate. There's no waiting. There's no like, well, we got to pay off this, or we've got to, whatever. And so, but what that meant too is as I moved from one thing to another and so on, the format changed, the size changed. I had to, tweak a few cards for people. Some of the designs changed just slightly with the shifting and layout, because we went from one size format to another. Um, I had
Oh, yeah.
originally, I had originally thought that these would be like many cards that were out 5 years ago. an image with a border, with a title at the bottom. And when we got to sort of laying them all out and realized that we could, do a full bleed and all that stuff, that shifted a few things as well. And, so it's been very interesting kind of migrating through all of this.
That's an interesting process. I think that I would, and I'm going to put this out there while everybody's watching you, I would love an article on the path, the journey of a deck from thought to completion, complete with the hurdles and the bumps and the pit, the what are those things called when you drive over them? Potholes.
Potholes.
Yeah, because they're as you're talking, we're not talking about on a play who's got a barn.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much bigger project. You have to think about, I mean, not just creation, but delivery. You're lucky that you've got an advertising background, at least in the graphic sense. That doesn't always translate to mean you've got a good marketing. I happen to know you do, but how do people, can you be all things? How can you wear that many hats in a project?
Exactly. And also too, like, I was really fortunate to have some people who really helped me out. Right. And so like Carrie Paris, who's, a wonderful human being and a delightful, talented artist, did all the title layouts and final card formatting for us. Right. And other people helped with, running down people. There are people who are like, I can send emails. I'm like, please get these people to get their contract into me, please.
Yeah.
Right? Like all this kind of stuff, because again, it all takes time. And I think that, I think you put it really well. I think that idea of the mollusk on frustration, right? Like there are these things that, when you run into a hurdle or a bump or whatever, there are certain kinds of things that just derailed me emotionally around continuing the project, right? Where I was literally like, you know what? I'm just going to delete everything, pretend like this never happened. And I'm like, but I can't, but I want to, and I don't want to work on it now. And and it seems like it ought to be easy enough to, kind of push through that, but it's not. And especially, if you have frustrating exchanges with people, you run into printers problems, you run into other, personal problems, and, it does make it hard to show up. Right. And that sort of, that like be a pro piece, right? Like it's there and it's important, but I would say be a pro and be real about being human, but be a pro if you can, right? And it's but it's not easy, right? It's not easy at all. And I think that anybody who wants to make a deck or whatever, if your life has any sort of complexities to it at all, right? Or you hit any bumps. I mean, there have been times in my life where if I had been making a deck, it probably would have been pretty smooth sailing, right? There have been years where things were smooth. They haven't been recent years, but there have been years, right? And, but I think that if you have stuff coming up, you got to respect it and try and roll with it and try and show up as often as you can, right? Because, the reality is that, none of us are getting any younger. And, this stuff, if you want to get your stuff out into the world, you gotta try and get it done. Like I feel like I have 5 decks in various states of thoughts or starting or whatever. I have 2 books that are partially written at this point, and like 3 others that I'm thinking about. So there's, if you're a creative person, you probably have lots of stuff to do. And, there's a great thing if you Google it called the Manifesto of Done. It's these 2 people came up with this sort of idea about how to get things finished. And the one that I use as my mantra these days a lot, I come back to it, is done is the engine of more. You know, and it's like, just get it finished and then you'll do more things. Just keep doing the things. And, you know, finished is good, right? Finished is ready for the next step, whatever it is, right?
Right.
So.
Judith Solt, who did oh, Judith, I cannot think of your deck name, and I'm so sorry. But she has a majors only deck. But she wrote a post, and it was called Albatross Days. And I read it because the title was like, huh, what's that?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, going on the I've got an albatross around my neck theory, that she set aside days that were albatross days. And on those days, nothing new got done. Nothing, she didn't do social media. She didn't answer the phone. She did stuff that needed to be done.
Yeah.
And get rid of the albatross.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks, and I'm in love with the idea. It really resonated with me because sometimes, you know, my to-do list is simply a rolling, oh shit, what haven't I done list?
Yeah.
It's not a to-done.
Exactly.
And so I like the idea of albatross days.
Yeah. You know, there another metaphor I heard for that is, you know, sometimes you got to eat your frogs, right? Like, what's the thing you don't want to do? Then just do it, get it done, right? You know, like at this time of year, as we're reaching, you know, the end of October, I'm looking at tax season being sort of 2 months out, and I'm like, how on top of my accounting and my other stuff am I? You know, I'm like, I got to start making some frog time to sit down and look at all that stuff closely and make sure that when we roll into the new year, I can just hand a pile of stuff to my accountant to be done, versus, you know, when I was much younger, what would have happened would have been like, well, they're not actually due until April 1st. So like, I can just leave it till, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not. So you have been in, I'm going to show the magazine. The Triumph of Life Tarot has been featured in the magazine, and I went back and looked up the issue number, but it's still available. So if folks want to get a copy, digital or hard copy, you can get a copy of where we showed this deck off a little bit in our art section. And the art section in here is basically, we take decks that people have sent us and then give them pretty layouts where you can see some nice cards. He is very much a mama's boy.
Yeah.
But we would love to see something from you in terms of the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be all about that.
So,
yeah,
you know, and I would love to feature your Llewellyn deck coming up. So make sure you get in touch with Llewellyn and tell them to send that to me.
Fall next year.
I talked to. Good.
Yeah.
I talked to Kat at Llewellyn quite a bit for getting reviews for my review team, because I have about 8 people who do reviews for the Cartomancer now. And the whole idea of this deck, this Triumph of Life deck, sorry, I've put him off my lap 4 times. I give.
That's okay. We can roll with the cat.
It's so wonderful. And I really want people to realize it's available tomorrow. So, you know, go and don't break the website, but get in line and get this deck. Have a charity that the money's going to, or are you going to parcel it out to different charities?
So let me show you, as we're reaching the end of our time here, maybe I'll show you one last card and we'll talk about it a little bit.
Please.
So this is the 5 of Wands, right? And the 5 of Wands is a card that I did, and I'm not sure how well it's showing up there, but there is right in the middle this very shadowy figure around the heart, but they're kind of like stars and other kinds of light in them. And you can see that all this other stuff is sort of flowing outwards. And the charity that I chose to donate to is the Terry Fox Foundation. And Terry Fox was really is like a hero of mine from my childhood. 30 odd years ago, Terry got cancer in his leg, had to have his leg amputated. And he said he decided that he would run across Canada to
I
raise
remember
money,
him. Thank
right?
you.
And so he started, right? And you think about this: he ran a marathon every day on his amputated leg, right? With 1980s technology, right? Like, it's amazing, right? And unfortunately, his cancer came back and took his life before he finished. But ever since then, Terry Fox Foundation runs marathons, runs events, right? Um, where people run for cancer research everywhere in Canada, right? Every school I've ever been in, every school my kids have been in, everybody does it, right? And when people run, they wear stickers to say who they're running for. And if you go to one of their bigger public events, you'll see people who are wearing red shirts. Again, you can see they're in the card here, right? And those are people who either have cancer or have overcome cancer who are running, right? And so this idea of this legacy, right, of this person, and when I was looking at charities and I was sort of looking at their how much goes to the charity, how much like all these things, right? You got to look at these things. Terry Fox, had a really good rating for those kinds of things, and the money that gets donated, the majority of it goes directly to cancer research. So it's really it's a great cause, I think. And I wanted to, well, one, I wanted to choose a cause because administratively it's easier, and like I just didn't want to be like, yeah, and 13.8% to these people. I mean, there's so many causes, right? But also I wanted to donate to a group that dealt with cancer. There's lots of specific, this cancer, that cancer, and I mean they're all worthy, right? Like this is one of the things. When you start looking at this, you're like, it's all worthy. But I
Mm-hmm.
decided that I wanted to donate to this group that funded research in a kind of open-ended, non just one gender or just one piece of our anatomy or these things kind of way. So I thought that was the way to go. So, yeah.
I really respect that. And particularly in light of some of the things that have come up around some of the other big associations. Like I personally won't donate to the Red Cross anymore, and I used to all the
Sure.
time, but now I pick different charities based on research.
Yeah.
So it's difficult in our world now. We our sophistication has led us into some areas of, it's not money is the root of evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. So it's you have to watch who's loving the money too much. But Andy,
For sure.
thank you. I know that you've got Halloween people heading towards your shop pretty soon,
Yeah.
so I want to let you get ready for that, so you can take off your scary mask and not be so scary.
And so let me say, the hermitslamp.com/TOL for Triumph of Life will get you to today a sort of holding page that has information, the story, and so on, and a spot if you want to be emailed a reminder to buy the deck when it launches. There's a spot you can drop your email in. That's the only email you will get from that is 2 reminders, one tomorrow when it launches and one in a week. And other than that, we won't email you anything else. And then starting tomorrow on November 1st, that website, that web link will just transfer you over to the live sales page on Game Crafters. And you'll see the same text will be there then, as well as a bunch of images of the artists with their cards, as well as of the cards themselves. And you can start buying that tomorrow, November 1st.
Very, very wonderful. And everybody, just a reminder, this is the Triumph of Life Tarot. Bill McGregor of the Hermit's Lamp is the mastermind behind it. I was going to say evil genius, but it's available on November the 1st. $12 out of every deck goes to the Terry Fox Foundation for cancer research. So it's a really important deck. I hope a lot of you will get on it. The links are going to be in the description box. But if you go to thehermitslamp.com, you can find stuff just from the front page. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'll see at the top, it also says Triumph of Life. There's a tab for it. So, yeah.
Perfect. So, and do me a favor, guys. Share this video today. Make it go viral, whatever you need to do. Tell everybody you know. Everybody has been touched by this horrendous disease. And if we in the tarot world can do just a tiny bit to push money towards kicking cancer in the ass, let's do it, okay?
You know what? I'll show you one last thing before we go. So on the back of the card, right, you can see that it's, at first glance, you know, from a distance, it looks just sort of like a regular card back pattern. But when you get up close, you can see that there are letters instead of patterning. And so each of the artists dedicated their artwork to somebody, and the back of the card is the initials of the people that everybody who made artwork dedicated it to. So all of those people in there and that vibe, it's all in the deck, right?
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. That's a beauty. So if you're watching this, I charge you with sharing it. So thank you, Andrew, very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Have you back. And seek joy, y'all. Pass it on. I didn't hit the red button, y'all, so hang on.